where if you legalize, things are going to get better and better. Legalization is a step forward. And that's not actually true. What we see with the norm against mercenaries is that legalization was a step backwards, because there was already a very strong and very clear sense that states thought mercenaries were a bad thing. And what they ended up with was law that didn't work. And the effect of that was making people think today that there was never any normative commitment against mercenaries whatsoever. So when people talk about regulating the private security industry, they say, well, no one ever cared about dealing with mercenaries. And that's simply not true. It's not the case. So in this case, creating the law actually probably weakened the norm. Also, we would assume that if you're a norm entrepreneur and you're out there and you want to make your norm into law, that being deeply committed to it is a good thing, because it's a very difficult process. You have to persuade lots of other people. You have to get international institutions on board. Surely you should be committed. Well, the work that I've done shows that sometimes being committed is actually a really bad thing. What happens with the anti-mercenary norm is states are too committed to it, because they're unwilling to water down what they believe is wrong about mercenaries in order to make the sacrifice necessary to make effective law. So sometimes strong commitment isn't a very good idea because it prevents necessary compromise, which is an inherent part of the international lawmaking process. Another way that international law that might not actually strengthen the effects of norm is that making a norm more precise doesn't necessarily make it more robust. So these international relations optimists will tell you that making it precise is good. People will argue about it less, will have clear consequences. Well, the law against mercenaries is extremely precise. It has all of those cumulative articles that we identified. You have to meet every single one of them. It's very, very, very precise, but it's terrible law. And there's a great quote that two people who write a lot about the relationship between norms and law, two international lawyers, have. Great Latin quote, which is the idea that to express one thing is to exclude another. So if you make law too precise, you inadvertently create a large number of loopholes. And this is exactly what we see in the international legal regime against mercenaries. The other problem with this is that some norms are just really hard to define precisely. And this anti-mercenary norm is a classic example of it, because as I identified at the very beginning, it's not logical. So if you try and sit down and make a logical law out of an illogical norm, you've got a significant amount of problem. And this was the idea that taking out the motive part of the definition would make the law totally meaningless. And states knew this, they were worried about it, and so what did they do? Well, they made the law more precise. They set down a series of cumulative conditions that were supposed to overcome the problem, and that didn't work. So in this case, both the IR optimists, the people who think that law matters, and the IR pessimists, the people who think that law is unimportant, are both wrong. And that in itself is very interesting because it helps us think more about what international law is capable of doing in the international system. I would also argue that creating ineffective law is probably worse than having no law at all. So activities during this lawmaking process, they don't violate the letter of the law. There was no case in that after this law was created in 1977 of significant violations of the law because the law was full of loopholes. Everybody just avoided it. But it violated the intent. The intent of the law was supposed to make it difficult to be a mercenary. And the law did nothing to help that happen. So basically, what you ended up with was all of these activities that made it look like the law was meaningless. People could point and say, well, there were mercenaries here, there were mercenaries here, there were mercenaries here, they were never punished. That must mean that no one ever cared about mercenaries enough to create law. And as I said before, that's simply not the case. Finally, it's been a bit of a death blow for the law against mercenaries that it can't be used against private military companies and private security companies. The reason for that is because of the way these companies are structured, that they specifically are often enrolled in the armed forces of the states, either which send them to a conflict or which hire them as part of a conflict. There's no way this law could apply, but most commentators say, oh, well, it's a lack of will. The international community doesn't care enough about this issue to legislate on it, and as we've seen before, that's not true. So the ineffective law might have eroded the anti-mercenary norm, which I identified before, because states today seem a whole lot less concerned about the idea of private force than they used to be. We have the United States employing between 20 and 60,000 private contractors in Iraq, which would have been unthinkable in the 1970s. So it may be that the norm entrepreneurs of this norm got it wrong, and that what they did was create bad law when they would have been better off creating no law at all. But weak law also has a very large number of practical implications. This stuff isn't just interesting in terms of the debate in international relations. It actually has significant implications on the ground. The first of which is we have no law to deal with mercenaries. There is no international law which effectively deals with mercenaries. And that means that the coup that Simon Mann and his cohorts conducted in Equatorial Guinea in 2004, the only law they could be charged with was a law that President Mugabe made up in order to charge them, because there weren't any other available laws. As I said before, the law doesn't apply to private military and private security companies, and this leads many people to believe that states never, ever, ever cared about creating law. And so what we have now is a potential obstacle to future law. We have all of these contractors in Iraq and Afghanistan, and most people's attitude is either, well, there can't be a law against them, or there is a law against them and it's bad. Both of those things suggest that no one cares about making international law. And that might mean that we have an obstacle to creating the necessary law we need to deal with private security companies in Iraq. Finally, there's the idea that we have this natural assumption in international relations to assume that law is always the best thing, that really law is a healthy and sensible thing to happen. And in fact, I would argue that norms can be better, and that we have a very long history of normative control over the use of force. And there are many shifts away from the use of mercenaries which were never written down in law and nonetheless worked. And so I've identified several of these phases. In between the 12th and the 14th century, there were lots of mercenaries on the battlefields of Europe. And these people were groups, little bands of mercenaries that roved around the countryside. And if you wanted to hire them, you could pay them some money. Sometimes you could pay them protection money so they wouldn't attack you. That completely disappeared by the 15th century, and I argue it disappeared because of normative discomfort with the use of mercenaries. At the end of the 19th century, remember I said no mercenaries at all between the 1850s and the 1960s. Part of the reason for that shift was at this time we were also developing citizen armies, and citizen armies don't fight for money, they fight for the glory of the state. They fight for the national ideal. And that normative shift made it very difficult, if not impossible, for states to use mercenaries. So here we have another case of states controlling their use of force without creating any sort of law at all. And in fact, by the time the Hague Conventions, which are the first big international attempt to create international law, roll around in the early 1900s, somebody puts up their hand at the Hague Conventions and says, oh, let's create a law about mercenaries. We don't like mercenaries. And the reaction is, why would we need to do that? Everyone knows they're bad. They don't exist anymore. What's the point in creating a law about them? So in fact, the norm in this case was stronger than the law. And we still see the norm against mercenaries having an influence, even though that influence might have been diminished by international law. And we see that in two places. There have been a lot written lately about privatized peacekeeping, the idea that maybe the solution for the UN is to have a private military company go perform peacekeeping missions, and you could send them wherever you wanted them to go, and it would stop you from having to rely on national member states to make contributions. The problem with that, and I went and did interviews at the UN about this a couple of years ago, and the response I got was that will happen when hell freezes over. Because people think that mercenaries, private military companies are mercenaries, and this is not something the international community should be engaged in doing. The other thing is at the beginning of the talk, I pointed out that Executive Outcomes and Sandline, the private military companies that actively provided combat, they're no longer in existence. And the reason why is because combat is too controversial a service. And I said before that one of the components of the norm against mercenary use is that the idea of killing for money is bad. Well, if you're engaging in combat and you're doing it for money, then you're doing a lot of killing for money. But private security companies have cleverly designed themselves so they don't engage in combat at all. They fit in with our normative expectations. They're less morally threatening. We don't worry about them so much. There might be all sorts of other reasons why we should worry about them, and I identified some of those this afternoon. But nonetheless, we have seen this very clear transition from all these companies out there providing active combat disappearing, and all of these companies who really avoid combat, and avoid combat to the point that many of them provide human rights services. So either training people in the application of human rights tactics or providing humanitarian aid. So the market has changed, I would argue, at least partly because of a norm against mercenary use. The final way that weak law really matters to us is in the creation of future law. And one of the things that I argued this afternoon is not only do we need a legal regime that deals with private security companies, we desperately need a legal regime that deals with mercenaries better than the one that we currently have now. And what this process I've shown can do is give us some tips for how we might go about creating better law. And the first one is creating laws which rely on motivation and complicated definitions are really, really difficult. And we don't just see this in mercenaries, we also see this in the case of terrorism, where the international community, despite repeated efforts of sitting down together, has not been able to define a terrorist. And part of the reason for that is because is this question of motivation. What motivates a terrorist? Is a terrorist someone who's motivated by political goals, by ideological goals, by religious goals? It's very hard to quantify motivation. The second problem is that mercenaries are a very, very complicated issue to legislate against. And this is, again, very similar to terrorists. There are all sorts of different types of people in the international system who we might call mercenaries, just as there are all sorts of different types of people in the international system who we might call terrorists. Some of those people we might think are kind of okay. Some of those people we might think are very, very bad. But what we're currently doing in the case of mercenaries is trying to fit them all in one basket and then being surprised that we can't make a good enough basket to carry them all around in. And in fact, what we need to do is separate them out. We need to deal with private security companies on the one hand and mercenaries on the other. The last thing, which is worth really considering, is that Article 51 of the UN Charter states that states have the right to take appropriate measures to ensure for their own self-defense. And you could argue that if a state wants to hire a private military company because it is unable to provide for its self-defense, maybe it ought to have that right. And maybe any international law we construct should be devised in order to facilitate that. That's quite a controversial thing, and I'm actually myself not entirely sure whether or not it's a good idea or a bad idea. But in the case of Sierra Leone in the 1990s, had the state not hired a private military company, it would have been taken over by a particularly gruesome and violent rebel movement whose favorite tactic was running around the countryside